Hello, everyone. My name is Selim Sırrıkuru. I am an associate professor and chair of the Near Eastern Languages and Civilization Department. I'm going to present the speaker for tonight, but first I would like to acknowledge the land we are standing upon. This event meets on the historic and contemporary lands of the Duwamish, Squamish, and Muckleshoot nations and other Coast Salish peoples who call the waters and coastline of the Salish Sea home. I would like to welcome you all to the fourth and the final presentation in the 2020 History Lecture Series, Life, Death, and the Gods. I would also like to extend a special welcome tonight to students from the University of Washington, but also those students who are from the Roosevelt and Garfield High Schools. Where are they? Say hi. I want to see you all at this university soon, so study harder. It is an honor for me to introduce Professor Joel Thomas Volker, the Lawrence J. Roseman Associate Professor of History with adjunct appointments in Classics, Comparative Religion, and Near Eastern Languages and Civilization departments. His talk tonight is titled Ancient Iran, Heaven, Hell, and the Good Life. Since he joined the University of Washington faculty in 1998, after receiving his degree from Princeton University, Professor Joel Volker on multiple occasions proved what a brilliant scholar, wonderful teacher and mentor, and a distinguished citizen of our university he is. It is not easy to introduce him and appreciate all his contributions to the culture of the University of Washington in a brief introduction. Still, I will try. As a scholar, Professor Volker's work makes a difference in the field of early Christianity in the Middle East, but he goes well beyond this field most of the time. One reviewer of his book, The Legend of Samarkand, Narrative and Christian Heroism in Late Antique Iraq, commended how Professor Volker unveiled the little-known world of 7th century Christian Iraq. Professor Volker's current project explores history of pearls in the arts, imagination, and economy of the ancient and late antique world. As a matter of fact, this Saturday, Joel will be delivering another talk at the Seattle Asian Art Museum's Saturday University series on this current project, and hear the title, and you will reserve your seats. The Dragon and the Pearl, Explorations of a Eurasian Motif. While Professor Joel Volker's scholarship is distinguished by his combining of early Christianity, medieval Islam, and evolution and symbolism of textual and material artifacts in time, his regular courses on the ancient world and Mongols, as well as others such as empires in ancient Iran or animal-human relations in history, attract a large number of students and inspire them about the study of history and cultures of the Middle East across ethnic and religious identities. Joel is a professor without borders. His interest in learning is contagious. He reads a lot and always ready to discuss what he reads with his students and colleagues. But you shouldn't picture him as a bookish introvert. Joel, in fact, reads to share, and he employs his learning and knowledge in building networks and bridges among them, creating a significant impact on our local communities and scholarly communities outside of our university. As the former director of NELC departments, my department's Persian and Iranian Studies program, Professor Volker established strong relations with the Iranian American community in Seattle and beyond. One recent event, the Ancient Iran Day, which was December 2018, it was attended by around 500 people, and it involved around 60 volunteers from faculty, undergraduate and graduate students, and community members. This testifies to Professor Volker's, or Joel's, leadership skills. Professor Volker recently reached out to local communities from Horn of Africa through a project in collaboration with Professor Hamza Zafer, which was supported by African Studies, History, Near Eastern Languages and Civilization, and the Simpson Center for the Humanities. Not only Joel developed and co-taught a very successful course on this topic, Horn of Africa, last quarter, but he also co-organized a series of talks that presented to the public rich history and cultures of this important region. With his at times difficult to curb enthusiasm, Professor Volker continues to develop the University of Washington's outreach to communities in Pacific Northwest and beyond. I feel constantly proud of Joel as a scholar, teacher, mentor, colleague, a leader, and last but not least, as a friend. You will witness only one side of him tonight, yet he gives meaning to our profession on all fronts. As I mentioned about today's lecture by Professor Joel Volker is titled Ancient Iran, Heaven, Hell, and the Good Life. After the lecture, Dean of College of Arts and Sciences, Professor Robert Stacy, Bob Stacy, another wonderful leader and friend, will be handling a question and answer session. You must be given some cards at the door during the lecture, or after the lecture. Please pass those cards with your questions to the aisle side of where you're sitting, and somebody will pick them up, and it will work that way. And Bob will be followed by brief remarks from another friend, Professor Glennis Young, chair of the history department, who will also announce the subject of the 2021 history lecture series. Please join me in welcoming Joel.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay? It's okay? Very good. Thank you, dear Professor Curer, for that over-generous introduction. Thank you to the Alumni Association and to the History Department, especially the staff who've made this happen. Thank you to my previous lectures in this series who've educated me and you about very interesting topics. And thank you to all of you for coming to hear a guy from Alabama talk about Zoroastrianism. What happens after death? Does a person live on in some new form after breath departs from the material body? How should the living care for the dead? And how do our choices about funerals and graves connect to larger beliefs about the soul and the afterlife? This lecture series has invited us to think about how four major societies in world history approach these questions. We've learned that the Aztecs, Romans, Chinese, each approach death and conceptualize the afterlife in ways quite different from the main funerary practices in modern America. My lecture this evening introduces a fourth cultural tradition, the Zoroastrian religion that arose among the Iranian-speaking people of Central Asia more than 3,000 years ago. Begin with the definition. What is Zoroastrianism? Zoroastrianism is the modern name for the primary religious tradition of ancient Iran. It's a tradition that survives, although on a much reduced scale, to this day. The religion's modern name refers to the tradition's prophet, Zarathustra, or as he's known in English, Zoroaster, which derives from the Greek spelling of the name. The same religion is often referred to as Mazdaism, which has nothing to do with a car. It's the name of a religion named after the chief god of the Zoroastrian pantheon, Ahura Mazda, which means literally the wise lord. You see here what is probably a depiction of the god shown on the lintel of the royal palace of Persepolis, carved in the reign of King Darius. This symbol today is known as the Faravar, and it remains a very potent symbol, widely recognized as a symbol of the religion, whether we call it Zoroastrianism or we call it the Mazdaean tradition, or as the ancient practitioners of the tradition called it, they said it was just the Beidin, the good religion, or the Mazda. They called themselves Mazda Yasnasians, or the worshippers of Mazda. These are all, it's all same names for the same stream of, same religious tradition, stream of tradition. And unlike Christianity, or Islam, or Buddhism for that matter, which hold that anyone from any culture could potentially become a believer, the good religion was always closely linked to ethnicities, to Iranian ethnicity. Its leaders rarely tried to convert others. Now that said, the good religion was once widespread among the Iranian-speaking peoples of the pre-Islamic Middle East, not just the region of modern Iran, bolstered by the support of the kings of the Achaemenid. Here you see the Achaemenid Empire, then the Parthian Empire, which I won't discuss tonight, and the Sasanian Empire. The religion left its mark on ideas and objects across a broad swath of the Middle East, from Central Asia in the east, across modern-day Iran, into Mesopotamia, the Caucasus, modern-day Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, as well as Anatolia, or modern-day Turkey. Zoroastrianism is also, we must remember, a living religion. It's practiced by around 100,000, 120,000 adherents across the globe today. And the largest of these communities is centered in northwestern India in the state of Gujarat, where local Zoroastrians are known as Parsis, that is, the people who come from Persia. This fire temple in Mumbai, formerly known as Bombay, was endowed by a prosperous merchant in the year 1709. It has architectural decor which echoes the design of the royal palaces of the Achaemenid and Sasanian periods. The global Zoroastrian diaspora today includes a sizable community in British Columbia and a much smaller, but I should say still quite learned and active community here in Seattle. And I believe we have a few of them here tonight. So I know you, but I can't see you in the crowd. And allow me to underscore up front that the picture of Zoroastrian practices that I'll paint tonight is a historical picture. Religions, like languages, evolve across time and space. And modern Zoroastrians have reinterpreted, modified, or replaced many of the rites that I'll describe tonight. But in Iran, and also in India, very traditional forms of Zoroastrian practice have endured almost to the present. And to illustrate this point, and to remind us of how even small, remote communities can sometimes connect us to a distant past, let me take you now to the city of Yazd in central Iran. And we have to consider in particular a monument that stands on the outskirts of Yazd, built sometime in the medieval period. We don't know exactly when. It's what's known as a dakhma. A dakhma is a space for the ritual exposure of corpses. Sited over on a high natural hill overlooking a gorge, the dakhma at Yazd has a circular form with high walls enclosing a sloped interior where corpses were placed in rows so that those corpses could be picked bare by nature's corpse cleansers. Now, from the mumbling, I'm going to interpret this to say that some of you find this an undesirable prospect, even for your corpse. Like the figure of Antigone in Sophocles' play of the same name, you may find the idea of leaving a corpse exposed to the sky or to scavengers an improper, unjust, even an abhorrent thing to do. But as this lecture series has shown so well, cultural traditions, ideas related to death do vary a lot. And if we want to understand why Zoroastrians handled their deceased ones in the ways that they did, we need to analyze our sources, and we have to try to reconstruct the origins, variety, and meaning of Zoroastrian mortuary traditions. The rest of tonight's lecture, therefore, will unfold in 4 parts. First, I'll unpack the internal logic of Zoroastrian views of death, corpses, and the afterlife. Why did they expose their loved ones, corpses of their loved ones, to the sky and the scavengers? Okay? These views are rooted, as we'll see, in the Avesta, Zoroastrian sacred texts, which were composed in an archaic form of Persian between roughly 1500 and 500 BC. You could break that down into more detail if you like. As we'll see, the earliest layers of the Zoroastrian tradition in the Avesta also reveal striking parallels to Greek, sometimes Indian, and other Indo-European areas of belief and mythology. Second, we'll explore the diversity of Zoroastrian mortuary practices with particular attention to archaeological evidence. The eastern Iranian zone of Sogdia in modern-day Uzbekistan preserves exquisite evidence for the use of dakmas and bone boxes, while the region of Fars in western Iran preserve burials that reveal a more oblique relationship to Zoroastrian ideals. We'll explore both of those, including the tomb you see here of King Darius cut into the cliff of Fars in southwestern Iran. We'll return to it in a moment. Third, we'll consider the evidence of Zoroastrian beliefs about the afterlife, focusing on the period of the Sasanian Empire, which ruled over Iran and really the whole Middle East between about 224 and the Arab invasions of the 640s. And for this, we'll discuss both the figure of Kirdir, who appeared on that opening slide, as well as the terrifying images of hell found in the Book of Art of Viraz. And fourth and last, I want to locate Zoroastrian death practices and afterlife beliefs in a broader comparative framework, inviting us to reflect on the relationship between Zoroastrian beliefs and those of other cultures of the ancient world, like Greeks and Israelites, Romans. Maybe even think a little more about how Zoroastrian traditions of heaven and hell might relate to Jewish, Christian, and Islamic beliefs. Though I better preface this by saying there are no easy answers on that second question. It's can only tackle it in small pieces. Now, let's get started. Zoroastrian teaching on death and the afterlife is grounded in a set of sacred hymns, prayers, and ritual instructions attributed to the prophet Zoroaster. Now, modern Zoroastrians often depict their prophet as a full-grown bearded man, like the one that you see here, in a very popular image, often found in devotional context. For the modern historian, Zoroaster is a much more elusive figure. Both the location and the dating of his earthly career remain disputed. He seems to have lived somewhere in the eastern Iranian world, northeastern Iranian world, probably around modern Turkmenistan during the early Iron Age, between around 1300 and 1000 BC. So that's about as close as you can get. And some people won't even agree to those parameters. Now, the hymns attributed to Zoroaster reveal the core concept of a cosmic struggle between good and evil that has underpinned Zoroastrian approaches to death and to the afterlife. The hymns, or the gathas of Zoroaster, celebrate the beauty and the order of the world created by Ahura Mazda. Earth, water, fire, and cattle, yes, I do mean cows, each hold a special place in this blessed material world that Ahura Mazda created based upon an earlier spiritual prototype. And the duty of every Zoroastrian is to praise Ahura Mazda and his divine allies. He's not the only god, there are a whole series of other gods. And to honor the sacred elements of his creation by cultivating, quote, good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. Now, why do Zoroastrians need to practice these virtues? Because the beauty and order of the material world has been corrupted by the evil spirit known in Middle Persian as Ahriman. Jealous of the beauty of Ahura Mazda's creation, Ahriman invaded it, introducing rot, stench, hatred, and death to the material world. Mankind alone cannot defeat Ahriman. But mankind, both men and women, can contribute to Ahura Mazda's ultimate victory by living just lives, by producing children, especially male children, and by protecting the sacred elements. Now, Zoroastrian teaching survives to the present because of a very long chain of first oral and then written transmission. For more than 1,000 years, Zoroastrian hymns and prayers were transmitted only in oral form. Get your mind around that. For more than 1,000 years, Zoroastrian teaching was preserved, transmitted only in oral form, passed down generations through meticulous techniques of memorization and recitation. Not until the period of late antiquity, probably between around 500 and 600 AD, was a special writing system developed, the one you see on this manuscript here. The writing system known as the Avesta Script, which allowed the Zoroastrians to record the Gathas and the rest of the Avestan corpus into written form for the first time. And this corpus of sacred texts, known collectively as the Avesta, survives only in part, and it survives in part because of manuscripts like this, preserved especially among the Parsis of North India. This one was copied by a priest in India in 1556. Now, the Avesta devotes numerous chapters to ritual requirements for the disposal of corpses. Excuse me. Talking about death makes you thirsty, apparently. In an important text known as the Vivdevdad, always tongue twister, it means roughly the manual for learning how to fight demons. The prophet Zoroaster asked Ahura Mazda how believers should dispose of corpses. And Ahura Mazda answers him. He says, so this Zoroaster says, O maker of the material world, O holy Ahura Mazda, where shall we bring and lay the bodies of the dead? Ahura Mazda answers the prophet Zoroaster. He says, bring them to the highest summits where they know that there are always corpse-eating dogs and corpse-eating birds, O holy Zarathustra. There shall the worshippers of Mazda fasten down the corpse by the feet and the hair with brass, stones, or lead, lest the corpse-eating dogs and birds carry the bones away to the water or to the trees. Now, this passage is one of many that underscore Zoroastrian's determination to keep the pollution of corpses separate from the sacred elements of earth, water, and fire. For Zoroastrians, there was nothing more contaminating than a corpse. They knew that Nasu, the female death demon, attacked even the corpses of righteous men or righteous women. It wasn't just bad bodies. Any human body, once dead, was subject to the attacks of the demonic forces of the death demon, sometimes appearing in the guise of a fly. Fastened down in the high places, or later behind the walls of the dogma, corpses could be stripped to the bone and purified by the rays of the sun. Now, dogs hold a complex and vital role in this Zoroastrian set of beliefs. Their purpose extended beyond the consumption of human flesh, which again, for most of us would say gross, okay? We're dealing with a very different culture here. It was also widely believed, gets even stranger, fascinating, that dogs' gaze had the power to scare away the death demon. The dog's viewing of a corpse, in Persian they have a special word for this, they call the Sogdian, it's when the dog sees the corpse, was an essential first step in the process of the soul's release to the other world. Didn't have to be a particularly pedigreed dog, like this Mastiff shown in a statue from Persepolis. It could be an ordinary dog, like this village cur from near Shiraz. Any dog could be used to perform this ritual. Some dogs were preferred, but any dog could do it. And so this viewing of the corpse by the dog, the Sogdian, was seen as essential. No piece of land which had been contaminated by the proximity of a corpse could be used again until it had been cleansed by the Sogdian. So you took a dog, after you took the corpse up to the dogma, you led the dog back and forth along the route of the same path before you brought fire or any sacred instruments over the same space. Now, I'm just going to sort of tease you here with a little comparative bit, and we'll come back to this a little bit at the end of the talk. The association of dogs with passage into the underworld is one of these features that connects Zoroastrianism to a broader realm of mythology, Indo-Iranian and even Indo-European mythology. And I'm not going to go into these comparisons right now, but just as a teaser, you might think of the role in Greek mythology of the dog Cerberus, which also guards the transition into the other world for souls. According to the Greek tradition, Cerberus, when souls came down to Hades, he wagged his tail when they arrived. Well, I don't know if he had 3 heads, but only 1 tail as far as I know. But then when they tried to leave, all 3 heads would growl, and refuse to let them pass back out. So the dog is the guardian of this transition into the other world. As it's a different set of stories, but sort of parallel function. And there's some parallels in Indic mythology as well. Now, let me talk a little bit about the actual burial practices, mortuary practices. Now, in the 6th century BC, the Persian rulers of the Achaemenid Empire adopted Mazda worship, the worship of Ahura Mazda. And this stimulated the circulation and emulation of Zoroastrian rites into new parts of the Middle East. The early Zoroastrian guidelines for corpse exposure, all the things I've talked about so far, detailed in the Avesta, those were not immediately adopted. They were only slowly filtered out and adopted across the Middle East, particularly among Iranian-speaking people. But the slowness of this process should not surprise us. If we learn anything from the comparative study of mortuary rites, it's that funerary practices rarely evolve quickly. People tend to be quite conservative in their choices about how to bury or not their loved ones. Only gradually, over the course of many centuries, the Zoroastrian ideas about death and the afterlife spread westward across from Central Asia, Iran, filtering into the Caucasus, Anatolia, and making their presence felt even in Mesopotamia and the Levant. All right. The resulting mortuary landscape was complex. There was a lot of regional variation, a lot of hybridity, mixed forms, and in many regions, people they worshipped Ahura Mazda, but they still engaged in burial practices which they inherited from previous cultures, the cultures of ancient Elam, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. So again, that sort of conservative tendency for people to change their mortuary practices very slowly, even as they adopt new beliefs. Now, perhaps the most striking innovation of this phase of Zoroastrian history is the rise of the hereditary priestly class known as the Magi. Now, they don't appear at all in the Avesta. They're first mentioned in a tomb inscription of King Darius the Great, the same inscription, same monument we saw before, and we'll see it again in another moment. And during the Achaemenid period, the Magi came to control many aspects of Zoroastrian ritual, including funerary rites. And their influence extended widely throughout the empire. This stone relief comes from northwestern Anatolia, that is northwestern Turkey today, and it shows a pair of Magi who've performed animal sacrifice. You can see the head of a sheep and bull there, and they're making prayers and holding the barsum in front of what appears to be a temple, appears to be in a funerary context. Excuse me, not a temple, it appears to be a tomb based on the architectural details. Now, the Greeks who lived in this part of Anatolia, this is the northwestern edge of the vast Achaemenid Empire, viewed the Magi with a mixture of awe and contempt. Greek accounts of Persian religion, full of distortions on the one hand, do get some things right. Herodotus, for instance, correctly notes that the Magi will sacrifice many animals, but never dogs. Now, the royal tombs of Fars region, we're back in southwestern Iran, powerfully illustrate the hybrid forms of mortuary practice that developed under Achaemenid rule. The funerary inscription of King Darius the Great, for instance, opens with a proclamation acknowledging his fealty to the chief god of the Zoroastrian pantheon. A great god is Ahura Mazda, who created this earth, who created yonder heaven, who created man, who created happiness for man, and who made Darius king, right? Bringing in Darius the king, bringing himself here tightly into connection with the power of the gods. But for Darius, there was no contradiction apparently between his devotion to Ahura Mazda, the chief god of the Zoroastrian system, and this choice of tomb monument. By encasing his corpse in a cliff, and thus avoiding polluting the earth below, he succeeded in one goal, but he also protected the body from defilement by scavengers, so a departure from the practices prescribed in the Avesta. The earlier tomb of Cyrus the Great at Pasargadae, the first Achaemenid capital, reveals a similar balance of different mortuary practices. The monumental tomb stands alone, raised above the earth on a high platform carved of giant ashlars. Its interior, roughly 2 by 3 by 6 meters, lies empty today. But it was once full of treasures, according to the reports collected by the historians and the retinue of Alexander of Macedon, who likely witnessed the looting of the golden coffin and the exquisite burial shrouds and weapons when Alexander conquered the Achaemenid Empire. Now think about the contrast here. The form of burial advocated in the Avesta leaves a corpse naked, exposed, and anonymous. It prioritizes protecting the sacred elements from the demonic forces of decay and instead exposes the corpse to the purifying power of the sun and the scavenging animals, since any corpse left unattended would contribute to the evil spirit Ahriman's campaign to bring disorder into the world. The kings of ancient Iran are explicitly Zoroastrian. They proclaim their fealty to Ahura Mazda, who placed them on the throne. But their burial practices express a very different set of concerns. Instead of approaching funerary rites as a way to restore balance in the cosmic order, the kings chose forms of monumental burial that dressed their corpses in luxury and fed their souls with animal sacrifice. The diversity of Zoroastrian burial practices becomes still more apparent when one considers the evidence from the eastern Iranian cultural zone of Sogdian, what is today southern Uzbekistan. This region reached the height of its prosperity during the period of late antiquity, especially in the 6th and 7th century AD, when merchants from cities like Paikand and Bukhara, and then Samarkand, or as it came to be known, Samarkand in the medieval period, dominated the Silk Road trade all the way to China. Foreign visitors to the region were often struck by the peculiarity of the Sogdian funerary practices. Writing in the early 7th century, the Chinese diplomat Wei Qie observed that outside the walls of Samarkand, it wasn't called Samarkand yet, but the city of Kand, there was, quote, a separate community of over 200 households who specialized in funerary matters. There's also a separate building in which dogs are kept. Whenever a person dies, members of the community go, they collect the corpse, and they place it directly inside the building in order for the dogs to devour it. When the flesh has been eaten entirely, they bury the bones, but without a coffin. Russian and Uzbek archaeologists have excavated a huge archive of material that confirms the prominence of Zoroastrian rites among the Sogdians. This evidence includes, for instance, the oldest surviving dakma in the world, Chilpik in the Karakalpakstan region of western Uzbekistan, where archaeologists documented the use of an exposure platform from the 1st century AD all the way down through the early Islamic period, with repairs as late as the 10th century. Now, this and other Sogdian sites have yielded dozens of terracotta ossuaries in which the excarnated bones of the deceased were buried, just as the Chinese ambassador described. Many of these Sogdian ossuaries or bone boxes include scenes of Zoroastrian ritual. Some of the scenes are relatively simple, like the 7th century example found near Samarkand, which depicts a pair of Magi flanking a fire altar. Note, they're wearing the mouth covering here, which protects the sacred fire from any contamination by spit, by accident, right? Other bone boxes have more elaborate and complex scenes of Zoroastrian ritual, like this slightly earlier example from southern Uzbekistan, from Shari Sabz, the later birthplace of Tamerlane. And on this box, you see nothing's labeled, so everything's open to interpretation, but it appears to be a nobleman and a noble female, though some people see this as a more symbolic figure, at a banquet entertained by a harp player. And then what matters for us here is this central figure who's again wearing the face mask, you see. So we're dealing again with a priest who's holding a bar psalm, which is the sacred prayer stick, and he's saying prayers over this table which has been set. But the figure who's most intriguing here is the central figure standing behind the table who's holding a set of scales. And here you see a diagonal figure who's naked. Who do you think that is? Art historians have argued that this is the soul of the deceased. And the soul of the deceased is being weighed by a divine figure, possibly Soros, the merits, to see the fate of the deceased soul. And look what the priest is doing with his other hand. Right? He's reaching up to tilt the scales. So whoever paid for this luxury deluxe ossuary or bone box seemed to believe that his piety, his paying for the prayers of the Magi, might also contribute directly to a better fate for his soul, getting that extra little weight on the scales. All right. This brings me to the third segment of tonight's lecture, a little bit shorter. How did Iranian mortuary beliefs relate to Zoroastrian, how did Iranian mortuary practices relate to Zoroastrian beliefs about the afterlife? And here too, we have to deal with a certain amount of complexity, since there's no one-to-one correlation between ritual and belief. But we do have some remarkably vivid and fascinating windows into Zoroastrian notions of the other world if we jump into the Sasanian period. Again, the late antique period between the 3rd and 7th century, which incidentally is the period that I first got me interested in Iran through Christian studies. Now, from the abundance of potential examples, textual, artistic, archaeological, I'm just going to discuss two. First, the extraordinary inscription of the chief priest, or magus. Magus is the singular of magi, in the Latin spelling. The chief Zoroastrian priest, Kerdir. This was carved in the late 3rd century. And then we'll talk about the popular Zoroastrian tale, A Journey to the Other World by one Arda Viraz. Now, sometime in the late 280s, during the reign of King Bahram II, a Zoroastrian priest named Kerdir gained a very high level of influence at the Sasanian court. In addition to the series of priestly titles which he proclaims in the inscriptions, Kerdir was granted the rare honor of having his image and accomplishments recorded in stone in the cliff face of Fars, right along those side of the images of the kings and gods. Two of these inscriptions detail Kerdir's journey to the other world. And while the inscriptions are imperfectly preserved, philologists have been able to put together enough that we can see the way in which these inscriptions describe Kerdir's remarkable journey. During his journey, Kirdir learns that the souls of the departed can pass into a refreshing, blessed place, heaven or paradise, or the souls could go to a cold, dark realm of torment, hell. The fate of a dead person's soul hinges on whether he or she has lived their lives in accordance with the precepts of Ahura Mazda. At the beginning of their journey, each soul is greeted by a female figure known as a Dana. In Kirdir's words, quote, "When I prayed to the gods, then I indicated this. If it's possible for you gods, then show me the appearance of heaven and hell. The just man's own Dana leads to paradise, while a wicked man's Dana leads to hell." So what is this Dana? Well, as later texts make clear, if we only had this text, we'd be thoroughly puzzled. But later Zoroastrian texts of the early Islamic period help us fill out the picture of what's going on here. The souls of the righteous are greeted by only the righteous souls are greeted by a lovely young female figure who is the personification, or the Dana, of their religion, of the good thoughts, good words, and good deeds they've practiced on earth, while the souls of the wicked are greeted by a rather different figure, a figure who is wicked, hideous, and repulsive, just like their words, thoughts, and deeds in the material world. The beautiful Dana has two nice dogs who accompany her. The Dana of the wicked is a witch. No dogs. Now, only the righteous are allowed to pass over the Chinvayat bridge into the next world. Chinvat bridge, which is narrow as a knife, leading into paradise. Since Kirdir is among the righteous, he merrily joins them. He goes on the luminous road, as he calls it, and he passes into eternal bliss, though he doesn't describe it in any detail, and we're going to leave him there. To learn the fate of the unrighteous, I'm going to turn to a different text, to a later textual source, probably from the late Sasanian early Islamic period, though the dating is uncertain. What's often called the Zoroastrian counterpart to Dante's Inferno, though there's no direct textual connection. The Book of Art of Viraz, the Righteous Viraz, shows how priestly authorities elaborated on Zoroastrian notions of heaven and hell as a tool for moral instruction. The text, composed perhaps around 600, as I say, gives this tour of heaven, though there are 101 chapters and 84 of the chapters are devoted to hell. So you get a brief description of heaven, where you have these souls living in jewels, gleaming, jeweled apparel, and then the divine guides lead Artaviraz down into the pit. And in the pit, Artaviraz sees half-animal demons wielding whips, drills, spears, and they deal out diverse forms of torture, each form tailored to match the crime of the deceased. Here you see a liar who's having his tongue ripped out. Many of the tortures are actually sexual in nature. Now, as horrifying as this may be to us today, it's clear that this book was very popular in Zoroastrian communities throughout the medieval period into modernity. Many translations into Persian, Gujarati, and modern anthropologists and insider accounts as well, both in Iran and both in India, speak to the enduring impact of this text, how terrified people would be as it was read out to them aloud. Part 4, final part, comparative perspectives. Now, we've learned tonight that the Zoroastrian practice of corpse exposure was closely linked to distinctive larger ideas about the material world, creation, and the soul. Zoroastrians refused to place corpses in the ground or in water or fire because the duty of every believer was to honor and uphold the good things in the world created by Ahura Mazda. Death and corpses belonged to the realm of the evil spirit, Ahriman. Their contagion had to be neutralized through prayer, ritual, and physical isolation. And sorry, I meant to have the slide up already. Again, the interior of the Dogma, and this is just a 19th century Zoroastrian teaching manual from India, which again articulates these same principles. Foul demons putrefy the body of the dead person, attack the living person. How do you respond? The recitation of the Gathas keeps demons away. The souls of the departed then receive comfort, and the living receive solace. If the Zoroastrian practice of corpse exposure seems strange or unnerving to you, you're in good company. The widespread view in the ancient world was that only the vanquished had their corpses fed to scavengers. For more than 4,000 years, kings boasted of feeding the corpses of their enemies to the vultures, as, for instance, one of our early Mesopotamian monuments, the stele of the vultures from early dynastic Mesopotamia. And there are numerous stories like this all the way through Mesopotamia, Israel, and the Greek world. And in Israel, too, Israelite tradition taught there was no greater shame than having your body tossed to the dogs, like the allegedly avaricious Phoenician princess and Israelite queen, Jezebel. So, I mean, you can see how Zoroastrians turned this idea on its head. They thought that by exposing the corpse, it would serve the purpose of restoring order to the world by cleansing, getting rid of the pollution, contagion around the corpse, whereas in Mesopotamia, Israel, so many other traditions, a corpse exposure was simply humiliating for the corpse of the deceased and their relatives. And indeed, other than the Zoroastrians, the only people in the ancient world who seemed to embrace the expectation of having one's corpse fed to scavengers were philosophers and radical thinkers. Sorry, I went the wrong way. Leave it to the philosophers to be provocative. Diogenes the Cynic assured his friends he wouldn't feel anything at all if his corpse was torn apart by birds and dogs, as he says here. How am I injured if I'm being torn by those animals, as if I had no sensation? But this is, again, a very minority opinion, to say the least. These comparisons really underscore how bold and unusual the Zoroastrian teaching was. I mean, Zoroastrians turned the view, they turned the view inside out, so that the exposure to corpses to scavengers was not humiliation, but was rather an act of piety. And the only close parallel to this is the Tibetan tradition of sky burial. I've never seen a systematic analysis comparing the two. There may be a genetic historical relationship. Zoroastrianism starts in the relative proximity to the Tibetan tradition, but I can't elaborate on the comparison beyond that. Consider another feature of Zoroastrian funeral practice: the deliberate isolation of corpses from normal social space. Here you see a group of professional corpse handlers who are delivering the body of a believer to the Dogma in Bombay. Zoroastrians were not alone in their fear of corpse pollution. Israelites, Greeks, Romans, others, they all created legislation that tried to shield urban spaces and shrines from the pollution of corpses. Zoroastrian tradition is unusual in only how quickly and strongly it sought to segregate the dead and to leave the tombs unmarked. Most societies in the ancient world expected families, particularly female relatives, to play the leading role in the preparation of a deceased body for burial. Archaic and classical Greek art preserves numerous scenes like this in which the female relatives weep over and then prepare the corpse for burial. Now, what you'll never find in the Zoroastrian tradition, Zoroastrians allowed family members to handle corpses, but what they never did was to go in the direction that Christians and Muslims did of having sacred corpses, right? Think about this difference as well. For Zoroastrians, the corpse ultimately was irredeemable, right? It's only a source of pollution. But in both Christian and Muslim tradition, there was the hope that the body could be purified for future resurrection, even if both Christians and Muslims debated and had differences in understanding what the nature of that resurrection body would be. Now, the relationship between Judaism and Zoroastrianism is a very complex one. There's more 1,000 years of interaction from the time in which Jews living in Mesopotamia came under Persian rule in the 6th century BC down to the Islamic conquest. And there's a dialogue between Judaism and Zoroastrianism throughout this long period, and it's not always clear which direction the influence is flowing. It's something that scholars continue to debate. My instinct is it's coming from Zoroastrianism to Judaism. There are some who argue differently. But the most striking parallel is in the use of bone boxes or ossuaries, which come into the early Jewish tradition during the early Roman period, when you start to have these forms of secondary burial in which, again, excarnated bones are placed into a bone box, which reminds us of the Zoroastrian tradition. But, again, it's not exactly clear which comes from which. Finally, think about the notions of heaven and hell, which are so instinctive for anyone who's grown up within in America, where, of course, beliefs about hell remained very widespread and common and powerful. So how does Zoroastrian notions of hell relate to, say, Christian and then later Islamic ones? It's not a case of direct influence, unless you argue that Zoroastrian notions of hell influence Jewish notions, which in turn influence Christian notions, which in turn influence Islamic notions, which indeed is possible, but it's more often you're looking at doing a sort of comparison. So in Christian hell, you frequently find fire as an element of torture. Of course, Zoroastrians don't think of it that way, but you have sort of similar, beastly creatures consuming human flesh in the afterlife. And indeed, these views remain powerful and widespread in both Christian and Islamic tradition to today. We should say also that notions of bodily resurrection, which become common in Judaism during the rabbinic period, not in the Israelite period, there's an evolution in Jewish views, that notions of the bodily resurrection in Judaism may also be related to those to the Zoroastrian tradition. For when Jews imagine the bodily resurrection as a frequently as this frequently illustrated example shows from the Dur Europa synagogue in eastern Syria, you can see that when Jews thought about resurrection, they expected it to be part of an eschatological moment in which all of Israel was restored. And the Zoroastrians also believe in bodily resurrection, and I'll give you the quotation from a late Sasanian apocalypse here, but it's not clear, which is influencing the other. But as you see, so there's a distinction here between the image and the text. I've mixed and matched here. This is a Jewish an image in the synagogue illustrating how Ezekiel's vision of the Valley of the Dry Bones was understood in the 3rd century. But the point is that it's this moment of reconstitution of the corpses, so that not just bones, but they come back into whole human figures. And you can see in Zoroastrian tradition also this notion of the physical resurrection. Those who are dead, Sosans, along with those who are the makers of perfection, who are his helpers, will raise up their bodies. Ahura Mazda will call their bones from the earth and blood from the water and hair from the plant and spirit from the wind. He'll mix one with the other and create the form which each has. So in closing, let me leave you with two final thoughts about Zoroastrianism. And both point to the theme of why the study of this tradition still matters, despite being relatively small scale in terms of global comparative religion, right? There are a lot of other traditions we could study that have more than 120,000 adherents. But I hope I've convinced you that that study of the Zoroastrian tradition is essential for understanding ancient Iran. Kingship, political ideology, Iranian art, the relationship between Iran and India and Central Asia and Anatolia, all of these topics require thinking about Zoroastrian tradition. And I would argue that there has never been a more important time for us, particularly in America, to think about the depth, complexity, and richness of ancient Iranian culture. The second reason I hope I've convinced you that Zoroastrianism is the gift for us today is that it also invites us into opening these new questions precisely because it is so different from the mainstream religious practices funerary practices that may be familiar to us today. Thinking about Zoroastrian forms of burial and beliefs of the afterlife can help us ask larger questions about how we should care for the dead, about what we believe happens to our identity after we leave this material world. We consign our mortal bodies to the earth, the sea, or the air. Thank you very much.
Wow. I have rarely learned so much in 50 minutes as I just did. Joel, thank you so much. There are people in the aisles to collect your cards. So please, if you do have a question, pass them over to the aisle and they'll bring them up here. If I could just start. I missed the first of these lectures. I've heard and enjoyed the last three, and I'm struck by the way in which, in all of these traditions, this period in the first 8 centuries of the Common Era seems to be a period in which people are really interested in elaborating their ideas about the afterlife, and particularly about hell. I mean, I'm not the first to observe that the devil gets all the best lines. It was true in Milton. It's true in Dante. I mean, how many people read the Paradiso? But everybody reads the Inferno. But China, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, it's certainly not a simple case of transmission, or even in some cases, even contact one with another.
Yeah.
And yet it's hard to miss the coincidence of time. Do you have any thoughts on that would help me sort it out?
I can't speak with any authority on Chinese or Buddhist notions of hell, though I have read in the secondary literature that there are a number of scholars who believe that Buddhist notions of hell are influenced by Zoroastrianism. And I don't know if our Professor Ebre's shaking her head yes, so I'm gonna take that as an affirmation that it's not a crazy idea. There's certainly people who will argue that the Zoroastrian ideas of the afterlife are the earliest and most influential. And I think the case for Zoroastrian influence on Judaism, I think it's pretty strong. I'm going to look to my colleague in early Judaism, or need to have a conversation with her, a longer conversation with her about this. Part of the problem in making these evaluations is the nature of the Zoroastrian sources. So we have elements of these afterlife beliefs that are present in the Avesta, okay? The Avesta is only dated by linguistic means, right? The estimate, when I said that the Avesta dates between 500 to 1500 BC, that's based on an analysis of the language primarily. And there are different layers, particularly between the so-called Old Avesta and the New Avesta. And so even in the Old Avesta, the oldest layer of that tradition, you have references to a hell-like place. But, in order to see how that, what the full conception of that hell-like place is, you have to turn to Zoroastrian texts written in the early Islamic period. And so how much of the sort of full descriptions of hell from the early Islamic period can you read back into text from 2,000 years earlier? So the methodological issues for the study of Zoroastrianism are extremely vexed. And I should say I'm not a historian of Zoroastrianism. I came at this, my interest in the topic was trying to understand how Christianity in the Sasanian world was in dialogue with various aspects of Zoroastrian tradition, or Persian culture more broadly, and that sort of started this interest in Zoroastrianism. But it's a dang hard topic.
Here's a question from one of our high school students who are here. Why has Zoroastrianism faded? It has not disappeared, as you pointed out right from the beginning. But for a religion that was so dominant in so much of the world for so long,
Right.
Clearly, that this is a pure area that was conquered by Islam, but still in all.
Yeah, the short answer is Islam happened. So as after the Islamic conquest that began in the 7th century, pushed Zoroastrians increasingly to the margins, though it's a process that extends over hundreds of years, right? So Zoroastrian communities remain first in mountainous territories. I mean, why do they survive in Yazd? It's because nobody gave a hoot about Yazd because it's a backwater place, right? The Zoroastrians in India go to India around the 10th century. I mean, there are stories, there's a story in the 16th century that tells of the migration to India. The early history is quite obscure. But then, of course, in India, the Zoroastrians become very, very important in the 17th and 18th century, especially because of their involvement in mercantile networks under British rule. And one of the, the book which I use for preparation of these lectures, for instance, a beautiful new history of Zoroastrianism, which was called The Everlasting Flame, was published in London about 5 or 6 years ago as part of a foundation of a new chair in Zoroastrian studies. So that even though the community is not very large, the descendants of the Parsis of India, many of these are quite cosmopolitan and often wealthy families who spread around the world. I keep looking at my colleague Anand Yang because I know in his work on modern South India and modern South India's connections to the rest of the world, he often speaks about the Parsis and looks at Parsi sources written by these modern Zoroastrians of India.
And what impact did Alexander the Great's conquest of Persia have on Zoroastrianism?
Well, so there's a very interesting narrative about this, which many contemporary Zoroastrians still believe, which is, so in Zoroastrian tradition, he's known as Alexander, not the Great, but Alexander the Cursed. And if you ever seen Michael Wood, the filmmaker, documentary filmmaker, Michael Wood, when he goes and he marches the route of Alexander's conquest, and when he's coming up to Persepolis, he goes with a group of local shepherds, and there's this one old shepherd there who's like, yeah, if Alexander was here right now, I'd stab him, I'd get revenge for my ancestors, So Alexander, the memory of Alexander in Iran is complicated. Within the Zoroastrian tradition, he's a purely negative figure. And the story is that Alexander, when he burned Persepolis, destroyed the earliest copy of the Avesta, which was written in gold ink on special extraordinary manuscripts. And that's still a belief that you'll find among some modern believers, but it seems to be a legend, simply to sort of enhance the destruction attributed to Alexander. Outside of the Persian tradition, in Iran as a whole, Alexander is absorbed into the Iranian tradition and sort of claimed as a partial ancestor. But within Zoroastrianism proper, his memory is Alexander the Cursed.
Okay. And let me bring you back to the bodies, because this is, we got a lot of questions on bodies here. Were women's bodies treated differently from men's bodies?
Great question. Oh, goodness. So there are two things in Zoroastrian ritual that are considered to cause the greatest impurity. One is a corpse, the other is menstrual blood. So throughout Zoroastrian ritual practice, there's a great concern for keeping menstrual blood away from anything sacred, which leads to various forms of restrictive practices on women during their period of menstruation. As for corpses, I don't know, I can't think of any evidence off the top of my head for instructions for how female corpses should be treated differently. In the Islamic period, there's more attention to ensuring the modesty of the female corpse. And there's a nice book called Muhammad's Grave about Islamic funerary practices, which detail that in considerable. But again, within Islam, because the corpse is redeemable, the role, both in Sunni and Shia Islam, the Shias absorb a little bit of the sort of Zoroastrian idea of the pollution of the corpse, it's a little more. But by washing and purifying and scenting the corpse, you can redeem it. You can even have a sacred corpse, right? Both Christianity and Islam have sacred corpses, relics of holy people. Not in Zoroastrianism. Irredeemable.
Yeah. And the ossuaries, the fact that we do get this tradition of visible ossuaries, the bones are no longer in the ground, presumably the ossuary is set up in a place. Does that suggest that people are coming to honor the individual or individuals who are buried, whose bones are there?
I don't know about the Jewish ossuary tradition. Again, I'm going to defer to my colleague Mika Ahuvia on Jewish. I opened up this broad comparative questions on purpose, but one of the things we need in that context is that dialogue with our peers, because you have to have such a sort of deep knowledge of each of these traditions to work through those comparisons. Which is why we need a death conference. I know it. Death workshop. Next week, let's get together. But for the Zoroastrian, I mean, the ossuaries were buried. And even the Chinese ambassador, whom I quoted about Samarkand, he says they bury the bones. So I don't think it's that even though you see they're beautifully worked, detailed, so they must have been on display for some point, but then they're buried. Or so and I don't read Russian. I haven't read the Russian excavation reports to see, but the museums in Uzbekistan are full of both complete and fragmentary ossuaries. There are many of these that survive. And what I didn't talk about, but I would love to, and I'm going to look at my colleague Pat Ebry here, is some of the most exciting Sogdian bone boxes have been found in northern China. And these are from Sogdian merchant families of the 6th and 7th century. And if any of you were there was a lecture at the Seattle Art Museum about a month ago, brilliant lecture on one of the Zoroastrian imagery on one of these Sogdian bone boxes from North China, where we get, for instance, our earliest image of the Chinvayat Bridge, the bridge that crosses over to paradise. But because it was put up by a merchant, the bridge is full of a caravan. There are all these camels going across the bridge. He's taking his goods into the next life.
Well, I think in pulling together so much of what we've heard these past 4 lectures, I think that's a really good place to end. Before I ask you to say thank you to Joel one more time, I want to just remind you, I'm going to bring Glennis up, and she will let you know what the series will be next year. But for tonight, Joel, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
So, good evening, everyone. I trust you can hear me back there. So, I'm Glennis Young, chair of the Department of History, and I'm here to say we've come to the end of History Lecture Series for 2020, Life, Death, and the Gods. I hope you've enjoyed the lectures that have taken us from the Aztecs to ancient Rome to early China, and now to Iran. Thank you for being an excellent audience. You've been attentive, curious, and brimming with questions. So as they say, you have rocked. How about a hand of applause for our audience? The Department of History has been really happy to have so many students from Garfield and Roosevelt High Schools with us. We hope that this series has helped to train, even if in just a small way, the next generation of historians. So thank you so much for joining us. And as my colleague Selim Kuru says, study hard and come here and major in history or whatever you want to major in, I should say. We've been happy to offer free tickets for students from the University of Washington, from other universities, from high schools, from elementary schools. And those tickets were sponsored by the University of Washington Alumni Association and Friends of History, and we're really glad to have done that. Speaking of expressions of gratitude, we have a lot to extend. So here we go. First, I'd like to thank very, very much the 4 lecturers, Adam Morin, Mira Green, Patricia Ebry, and Joel Walker for their fantastic lectures. From the University of Washington Alumni Association, thanks go to Amy Goodlow and Kristen Shire. And from history, we have an awesome staff and team in the history department. Thanks go to Alexander Colley, Shannon Vasek, Tracy Mashman-Morrissey, Josh Apfel, Ileana Rodriguez Silva, who met with high school students before the first lecture, and others who deserve our thanks for making the series so successful are Anita Verna Crofts, Dean Robert Stacy, Jennifer Smith, Alan Gowing, and Selim Kuru. So, as has been mentioned, it's customary to announce next year's series at the close of a series. And I'd like to announce that the theme of next year's series is provisionally titled Technology and Its Discontents. The lectures are to be announced, but I can guarantee, as much as one can guarantee anything in life, that the lectures will be fantastic. So my recommendation is don't miss it, put it on your calendars. So thank you so much for being a part of History Lecture Series 2020, and we look forward to seeing you very, very much about a year from now for History Lecture Series 2021. Again, thank you very, very much.